Welcome to the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Pauline Baudu, Director of the Climate Security Program, and it's January 23rd, 2026. Thanks for tuning in. This podcast is usually hosted by my dear colleague Josh Mull. Last week on this podcast, my colleague Josh and his guests discussed evolving U.S. policy in the Americas, including events in Venezuela, and what they signal for continental security and the reemergence of a modernized Monroe Doctrine. Today, we turn north to a closely related and equally consequential issue, Greenland. Recent weeks have seen renewed and increasingly provocative rhetoric from U.S. President Donald Trump regarding Greenland, suggesting that the territory should fall under U.S. control and refusing to exclude military intervention as a means to achieve this. These statements, along with symbolic gestures such as the circulation of maps this week depicting Greenland and even Canada as part of the United States, have drawn sharp diplomatic pushback from Canadian and European leaders and raised serious questions about sovereignty, alliance politics, and the future of NATO and Arctic security. They also place Greenland and Denmark squarely at the center of a debate driven as much by climate and resource narratives as by territorial defense. To unpack the myth and the realities around the link between Greenland and U.S. security and the strategic implications of these developments for Canada, we will hear today from Huebert Exner-Pirot, Director of Energy, Natural Resources and Environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Rob Huebert, Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary and Director of the Center for Military and Strategic Studies, and Marisol Maddox, Senior Arctic Fellow at the Institute of Arctic Studies of Dartmouth College. To kick off today's episode, we will start with the insights brought by Heather. Heather, thank you for joining us.
Delighted to be here.
So Heather, to start us off, there's been a lot of talk in recent weeks about Greenland's strategic value and why it matters so much to Washington. Much of the public justification for renewed U.S. interest in Greenland is framed around national security, keeping China and Russia out. Greenland is cast as a future strategic and energy hub for the U.S. From a practical, economic, and security standpoint, I'm curious, how significant is really Greenland today? Are these narratives appropriately factoring the constraints of the geography of Greenland and Arctic resource development?
Yeah, in my opinion, there hasn't obviously been a good case to be made for why the United States would have to own Greenland. And there's obviously been some, hyperbole, and I would say some misinformation about, why Greenland would be of such importance or why it would be necessary for the United States to control it. So this clearly stems, though, from, I would say an amateur understanding of the Monroe Doctrine and the way that has, implemented it with Trump influencers and the idea that they want this Western hemispheric dominance. And Greenland, is at the top of the hemisphere. And there's a sense of entitlement. And, we've heard comments that it's not really a part of Europe. It's more a part of the Western hemisphere. And this is the United States. But just to get into kind of the more specifics of why the Arctic matters in security, and I'll get into critical minerals. I think we'll talk a lot about that. It's not really critical minerals. There's not, frankly, a lot of mineral development in the Arctic. It's just a very expensive place to operate, and climate change isn't really changing that to make it more profitable. It is, for me, really about hypersonic missiles. It was about nuclear war, and it is the closest approach for Russia to attack the United States, the shortest distance, and also harder one to detect. That there's just less ability to monitor and detect from there. So the northern flank is vulnerable China and United and Russia have developed advanced weapon systems that, currently the North Warning System wouldn't be able to detect or may not be able to be in a position to detect. That affects our entire nuclear deterrence strategy. And so that is why you would want to have, again, NORAD modernization. That's why the topic of discussion between Canada and the United States and where we're directing so much of our defense spending is on NORAD modernization. It is to detect early and be able to intercept those missiles before they could get to American urban targets. In terms of, the other thing, shipping, no, I don't know, Pauline, you could ask me, Liz will talk specifically about shipping. That's not one. Critical minerals is not one. The inability, Russia and China operating, as I think as the Danish, general said earlier this week, there have not been evidence of Chinese warships in 10 years. They're clearly much more active on the Alaskan side of the Arctic because it's the Pacific, because China's just on the other side of the Pacific. But the last thing I'll say before we get into critical minerals and shipping is that Russia does have its northern fleet. I think people don't appreciate the significance of this, based on the Kola Peninsula, in and around Murmansk. And the reason they do that, and then we'll say, oh, they're concentrated in the Arctic. The reason it's there happens to be, in the Arctic Circle, is because that is a year-round open port to the North Atlantic, that their ships can go in and out all through the year. And Russia has no other toehold into the North Atlantic. And obviously, we know in nuclear deterrence strategy, it's absolutely essential that, that they can have a naval capacity with, as a nuclear deterrent. And without that northern fleet, they don't. And so the buildup in the Russian Arctic is really about a buildup into the Kola Peninsula, which is their toehold into the North Atlantic. And so Russia does need that GI-UK gap, that Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, to be able to operate throughout the globe, especially on the Atlantic side. And that is why, I would say Greenland and Iceland are strategic in terms of being able to, again, to monitor, detect and intercept if possible.
So that's super helpful. So really security focused. You've touched on the realities of what's actually possible in Greenland. That brings us to that broader assumption that you mentioned, and that comes up again and again in Arctic debates. That melting ice makes Arctic development easier, and yet you said it's not necessarily making it more profitable. So in practice, how does climate change actually shape resource extraction, infrastructure, and even military presence in the north? And why do you think those constraints are so often left out of security debates about the Arctic?
Yeah, I feel like, it's almost a personal failure that for 20 years, almost every Arctic article has started with that same paragraph, that same assumption. I've been saying, for 10 or 15 years, it's not correct. And that has never penetrated into the consciousness. I've absolutely failed in communicating this. But here's another chance for me to do it to a different audience. The Arctic, I always, I feel like there's a sense that mining companies just want to go extract and exploit wherever they can, and they go into every corner. And in the Western liberal society, the response has been to resist this, that we need to slow it down or stop or control this inevitable, raping of the land that they would do otherwise. In actual fact, these are publicly traded companies, trying to, earn a reasonable rate of return, and trying to improve their shareholder price and trying to make their shareholders happy. And mining is one of the hardest sectors to do that in, because you're talking about physical assets. You're talking about very long time horizons. On average in the world, it's over 15 years from discovery to production of something. It's longer than that in Canada and the United States. And it is not for the faint of heart. And when capital is more expensive in an inflationary period as it is right now, those 15-year timelines are even harder to fundraise for in markets. And now, as a fun kind of addition, they've been competing against tech. We're really exceptionally for the last 20 years, and tech delivers quick returns and scales very quickly, and has been very hard to attract capital into mining when you're competing with tech. And so the commodity prices have been low, actually, for the last 10 years. The last commodity cycle saw a peak about 2013. It had a bust, the boom turned into a bust. So there's even been less capital in mining for the last 10 years than there kind of would be normal on a historic or average baseline. So now you want to do it in the Arctic. And I'll say, and your costs are going to be double or triple if you want to do it in the Arctic. And in Canada today, we have 8 mines, and I always point this out. We're down to 8 mines. There's only 1 in the Yukon. There's 3 in Northwest Territories. They're all diamond mines. 1 is closing this quarter, and the other 2, because the commodity price of diamonds will, follow in the coming, certainly by 2030, if not sooner. And the mines that we actually have in the Canadian Arctic, and it's not much better in Alaska or Greenland or Russia because they face the same problems, tend to be gold, because you don't need a lot of infrastructure for gold. You can literally fly out the product. It's very high value, low weight. Diamonds and silver, kind of in that same category. So what help is climate change in this construct? What can climate change do? In the best case scenario, and I'll tell you why it's not, that's not even what's happening. You would say if you had a deposit relatively close to tidewater, that might give you, an extra couple of weeks on your shipping season. And if, the economically, having a deposit that has a 5-month shipping season or a 4-month shipping season isn't much different from investor perspective. It's almost in the same category. So even that extra 3 or 4 weeks of shipping doesn't move the needle much on the economics of it. But that's just the shipping. And we know, and we can get into it, but what's actually happened is that the shipping isn't easier with climate change, that it has melted sea ice, there's more bergy bits, they're choke pointing in certain areas, it's less predictable, both in the Northern Sea Route but for sure in the Northwest Passage. It isn't easier to ship. And the shipping was the only thing that climate change was going to give you. Now, climate change is taking away in many other respects. So one is building linear infrastructure, whether it's a road or a railroad, on melting permafrost. Obviously, terrible to have to build a railroad on melting permafrost. And if you're going to do it, well, now your costs are go up kind of exponentially because of all the, you have to go deeper, you have to have more material, all those things. And the other flip side is that if you wanted to use an ice road, which was, for example, what the diamonds do, you want to use that ice road. Well, now that season is shorter because of climate change. And now what was maybe a 3-month reliable ice road season in some of these recent years has been 2 months. So the logistics of having to get all your equipment, of having to coordinate all your diesel deliveries in it is, in a 30% shorter window, means that it's more expensive because you have to deliver more in a shorter amount of period, and you have to get more trucks, and you have to get more drivers, and you have to do more things. So there's so many ways. And on top of that, you still have a fly-in, fly-out workforce. You're still very far from markets. You still are operating remotely where you don't have good access to energy, to electricity, to satellite communications, fiber, all those things. So as a whole, people think that climate change is the big indicator of whether you're going to do resource development in the Arctic or not. No, it's the commodity price, and the commodity price has to be very high to justify an Arctic investment.
Thank you for bringing facts in the conversation. These are very technical aspects, and they're left out of the conversation. And it's so valuable to hear your expert perspective on this. So thank you. You mentioned Arctic shipping, often invoked to justify heightened strategic competition. Yet you mentioned that commercially it remains marginal, highly constrained. Do you want to develop on this idea more, and why does this idea of the Arctic as a future global trade highway remain so influential in defense and political circles despite weak empirical evidence? And I know you mentioned the role of experts, where there's a whole community of Arctic security experts trying to bring nuance in this conversation too. So perhaps my second follow-up question to that is, how do we bring evidence in the conversation so that it reaches U.S. policymaking circles?
Yeah, great question. I would say on the question of Arctic shipping, it is so grained part of the problem is that the Arctic is exotic. Most people haven't been there. Most people will never be there, and they have developed, there's kind of a consensus, narrative about the Arctic that everyone is born and bred off of, and you never hear conflicting stories. And then maybe you do get to, working in the Department of Defense or the Prime Minister's office or an embassy or something. And you just bring all those assumptions with you because no one has ever said otherwise. And you've heard it in the New York Times, and you've heard it in defense strategies, and you've heard it from prime ministers, and no one has ever said otherwise. And so I think even if someone like me says, no, that's, you're wrong, the first thing will be disbelief, that you're just being a contrarian. So I think that's part of the structural problem. But on shipping, I mean, there was obviously a ton of evidence, and people do follow this and publish this, and there's a lot of data to go by. So it's not even conjecture. But where it comes down to, for me, when you think about how do narratives get developed, for me, Al Gore, and, the inconvenient truth, and talking about how sea ice, that very likely the Arctic would be open by 2030, that penetrated the consciousness and has set the stage for a lot of this discussion where people relate it back to Al Gore or not. And that was the same time where the Russians planted the titanium flag and Harper said, use it or lose it. That was that same set of circumstances. What happened in those years, 2006, 2000, 2008, on Arctic ice is that you did see a dramatic loss of Arctic sea ice in 2007 and then again in 2012. And if you looked at a chart and you took a ruler and you started at 1980 and you went down to 2007, 2012, it was absolutely a steep decline. And if you just followed that line down, you could reasonably make the argument that by 2030, that ice would be gone based on those 2 years. But it turns out that those 2 years were outliers. And actually, it's 2026 now. We haven't seen a low as 2012 and 2007. And so if you started as a base year of 2007, you'd say, well, it's plateaued, actually. What happened, there's still climate change, for sure. So what happened with the sea ice? It was the rapid loss of multi-year sea ice happened in that period. And now that multi-year sea ice is mostly gone. And so we have a lot more new sea ice, first-year sea ice. But that first-year sea ice still comes back every year. So it's always first-year sea ice, but it is always there. Why is that? We're going to hit a cold snap. A lot of people are going to be feeling minus 30, minus 40 this week. At the top of the world in the winter, it's pitch black and there is no sun and the ice comes back and the earth tilts at 23 degrees. And so it will always be dark for 3 months in the Arctic. And so the ice will always come back. And what's interesting to me is that we focus on kind of the September sea ice minimum. Those are what we have graphs on. You say, oh, we've lost 30%, based on the kind of the 1980 baseline. But the March, conversely, on March 15th, you have the maximum sea ice extent every year, give or take a few days. And that one is fairly stable. So we're about 95% of what it was back in 1980. And so even though the ice character has changed, it is thinner for sure. But again, looking at it from my perspective of access for shipment companies or for resource companies is not better. And so this discussion on sea ice and the nature of it and how it affects animals is different from, is it easier to ship? Is it cheaper to ship? Is it a better route? And we've seen this. And so, some of our colleagues and Jackie Dawson will be familiar. Some have done this research, that actually the season has been shortening. This year's Northwest Passage season was only 70 days. That's not very long if you're trying to build a port and make that port economic. And that the, administrators of the Northern Sea Route are saying the same things on the Russian side. And even though they are exporting liquefying natural gas in their Arctic, they are not able to ship it east through the Northern Sea Route to Asian markets in the winter. They aren't doing that, even with their fantastic nuclear ice-breaking fleet. And so to get into just a little bit more of the Canadian context, because I just can't miss this opportunity, when we're talking about Churchill, or we're talking about Grays Bay and Port, and about all these major projects in Canada and nation building, everyone has to appreciate that a seasonal port is not economic, in almost any regard. Being the seasonality kills the economics. And it may have, you may say, well, it's worth it to subsidize it for some other goals. Fine, you can say that. You will not have a major export port. Churchill will not compete with Vancouver, Montreal, Halifax. It won't even compete with Prince Rupert or Sydney because it is a seasonal port. And then you add to that, what you're talking about in Grays, Grays Bay. It's not like absolutely not. Well, it will be a trickle if you get any kind of exports of commodities out of there. So it's more complicated, it's more complex. You will not get insurance. And that's what it comes down to. You can say what you want about governments or strategy or, Russia or China. Shippers will not get insurance to go through those waters through the ice, I have to say, in the winter, because it is too dangerous and it would be too expensive. The amount of ship breaking you would need to escort you, and the amount of capacity you would have to have a polar code vessel yourself with an ice breaking escort. It just does not make sense.
Yeah, that's another element that gets kind of overshadowed in debates. So yeah, that contrasts with the general discourse we're hearing about Arctic development. So let's move to Canada now. This also raises a bigger question about how Canada should interpret all of this. So, and that really connects to the conclusion of what you just said on whether or not deterrence is working. But how seriously should Canada treat U.S. rhetoric around Greenland as a national security issue, especially in the context of the newly reaffirmed Monroe Doctrine? Does this signal potential economic or political pressure on Canada over its own Arctic territories, particularly given the mineral resources of the Canadian North, and perhaps also where is Canada most vulnerable to similar forms of pressure?
It does. If you wouldn't take this seriously at this point, I think you have your head in the sand. And obviously Trump posted that picture of Canada, Greenland, Venezuela with the American flag, just a few days ago, in a way of saying you're next. And obviously the Globe and Mail, had a headline that the Canadian military has drafted some plans, some scenarios of what to do in case of an American invasion, which is, we're certainly in the upside down right now. But I am still, I don't think it's optimism. I think I'm rationally analyzing the situation. And, although I think we need to, say that this is unacceptable as a form of deterrence, that we're willing to impose costs, we're willing to absorb some pain to prevent this. It would not be popular with the United States. It isn't. It would not be popular with Congress. We're expected a tariff decision even this week. So Trump's hands, I think, will be further tied on tariffs. You're coming into midterms. A lot of Republican Congress people will lose their elections because of Trump and because of his unpopularity. So I feel as though Greenland kind of was the last line, and I don't think it'll get to Canada now. And I am reassured because some people listening to you, I think, will know some American servicemen and Canadian servicemen and military and people who, are in NORAD, in service to our mutual defense together and know each other. And as everything I've heard is that is broadly still functioning very well. And you've heard even, Canadian, generals, Danish generals say, the cooperation with the U.S. military is good. Canada and the United States both continued with a previously planned exercise, activity in Greenland just this week. And obviously NORAD is still, I think, kind of the rational, sober, has not been messed with at this point. So again, although, obviously situations have deteriorated, I do feel as though this week marks, a point where Trump is getting the pushback that he has not felt until this week. Maybe there'll be an irrational response to that. But I feel as though there are some institutional blocks that are now being activated.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Heather, for bringing your insights and bringing nuance.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll now turn to our interview with Rob Huebert. Rob, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, it's always my pleasure.
So I'd like to approach this from an Arctic security and defense lens and move past the U.S. administration's recent public rhetoric. Given that the U.S. already has extensive military access, basing rights in Greenland, would acquiring the territory actually strengthen U.S. national security in practical terms? What would realistically change for U.S. and Arctic defense? And based on this, maybe what can we expect to be included in the framework of an agreement that was announced yesterday by President Trump based on conversations with the NATO Secretary General?
Well, this is the paradox, but this is what I think we've come to expect from the second version of the Trump administration. If, in fact, the Americans continue to push for greater control, whatever that means, that actually has the effect of decreasing both American and Western Arctic security. The Americans already, since 1951, and one could even argue going back to the Second World War when they in fact occupied Greenland, have had complete control in order to do whatever they felt necessary in terms of defense. The first defense obviously was against the Germans, but by 1951, when the Cold War was clear that it was emerging, an agreement was reached between the Americans and the Danes to allow them to have base rights, including the usage of nuclear weapons. And the reason we know that is in 1968, there was a broken arrow incident in which the B-52 crashed, and there were, in fact, bombs lost on Greenland territory. They recovered 3 out of the 4, but 1 is still said to be missing. Now, if Trump continues to push and just say what he did in Davos was just his typical ebb and flow when all of a sudden it looks like he's giving in and then he turns around and comes back twice as hard. What will happen is that will have a serious negative effect on the alliance. And it means that Denmark, the United Kingdom, all the countries who've taken a strong position against Trump's actions will become less likely to be working as close with the Americans in terms of the maritime protection in the regions. So in other words, Trump already has the ability to build whatever bases, capability he needs to respond to the aerospace threat coming from the Russians. And in fact, back in, I believe it was 2014, they changed the nature of the base, then known as Thule, now, of course, Pithak, from basically a surveillance system into one of their space bases where it's tied increasingly into their, so what Trump calls the Golden Dome, but it's actually the anti-aerospace protection that they need from the Russians. Now, here's the kicker. If, in fact, the United States now says we have to conquer Greenland and say they try, Trump breaks his word, but he says he's not using force, he uses force, how do we expect to see the United States then continuing then to work with Denmark, with Norway, with the UK in terms of the maritime southern approaches, particularly the GI-UK gap? I mean, that relies on NATO cooperation. And what that means is that the Americans are either left to do it by themselves or the Europeans have to do it by themselves. But however you spell it, it means greater accessibility for the Russian submarines to enter into the Atlantic. And so it's just, any way you spin it, an American determination to control Greenland means less security for the U.S. against the Russians and less security for the Western Europeans.
And you mentioned a broader regional impact. So looking beyond Greenland, this also raises questions much closer to home. And some of the recent signals haven't been subtle. As I mentioned in the introduction, President Trump recently shared a map depicting both Canada and Greenland as part of the U.S. So in Arctic security terms, how should Canada interpret that kind of symbolic move in your perspective?
Well, this is the first time that we've actually seen the Americans talking about conquering, in this case, all of Canada, but in the context of the overall conversation of Arctic security, of actually conquering land territory of Canada. Now, again, we have to be careful. This might just be rhetoric. This might be just, Trump supporters will say, well, this is just the art of the deal. He does that to go to extreme positions, but he doesn't really mean that he's going to invade you. But you got to step back and say, yeah, but he's been doing the tariffs and undermining our economic security basically since he's been in term. And so you got to be a little careful about some of his apologists. And I think what that spells out for Arctic security, if he is indeed has come to the conclusion, him and his inner circle, that there is a threat to American security vis-a-vis the Arctic, regardless of what the facts are, he feels that it is necessary that the only way he can achieve it is by direct American intervention. Then that spells out that we might be seeing a consideration for the Americans at a minimum trying to see some parts of the Canadian North to put in some of the radar sites that we have been constantly talking about putting in. Now, this is the kicker. For Canada, we've known a long time that we've had to modernize NORAD. We knew that the Russians were developing these new systems ever since General Van Herk, the former head of NORAD and Northcom, had warned that the new Russian capabilities were beyond current NORAD detection capabilities. We said so in Strong, Secure, and Engaged. The problem is, of course, we never did anything until really around 2022. That's when we start seeing us getting serious about the modernization. So on the one hand, we know that even before Trump, the Americans were getting concerned about our lack of effort. We get back to the classic defense against help. On the other hand, are the Americans now of such a mindset that they figure that, hey, if we can't depend on our partners to do it, we'll just simply do it ourselves? And then you tie it in to the current American security policy that's been developed that basically, as you mentioned in the introduction, has returned the Americans to some variant of the Monroe Doctrine. And we see the behavior of what he's already done in Venezuela, threatening to do in Cuba, the map. In other words, do we now have to start seriously thinking that the Americans may, in fact, figure out that the only way that they can be assured that that will be taken care of is if, in fact, that they seize some of the territory? Now, we may only be talking about some of the very northernmost tips, because that's where you have to put in some of the elements of the over-the-horizon radar. But again, they may be also thinking about basing for some of their aircraft. I mean, who knows in terms of what the actual thinking is opposed to the rhetoric. But this is the first time we've returned to it where we really have to be very vigilant of what the Americans are doing. And of course, we have to really pick up the pace for ourselves in what we are going to be doing for NORAD modernization at the same time.
Yes, I feel like the distinction between the actual thinking and the rhetoric has been a kind of the challenge in the past year. So especially in this case, should the U.S. administration follow through and shift its attention to Canada in the same way that it or in a similar way that it has been doing for Greenland? Where is Canada most exposed, in your view, to similar forms of economic or political pressure in the Arctic, but also more broadly? And are we sufficiently prepared to respond to that kind of leverage?
I don't think we are, because we've had as the bedrock of Canadian security policy that we've had such a good relationship with the Americans that we've never had to really worry about it. And, some would argue, of course, is that we've taken advantage of that goodwill to allow us to basically be very slack on terms of our own defense orientation. Now, basically, I think that we have to be very concerned about the Americans in terms of what they're doing, because, as you correctly point out, there is that divide between rhetoric and action. But look internally what Trump has done. I mean, the development of a policing force that seemingly is acting without the normal requirements of the American judicial system, and I'm referring specifically to ICE, and the way that it is, in fact, directed to democratic states, i.e., a very clearly political use of force within the United States. And I think that should tip us off that if the Americans are able to accept that and do that within their own borders, that we have to be very careful in terms of the overall rhetoric. Now, where are the Americans going to move? In the worst scenario, they, of course, annex us, which means, remember, it's sort of like the same thing as what the Russians do to Crimea. They illegally occupy. Like, let's be realistic. That is war. That is an invasion. And so are we going to be facing something similar to that degree? That's probably one of the very worst scenarios. Will we instead see continued political pressure? And from an economic perspective, absolutely. I mean, that's not theoretical. They're doing it already. The third element, and I don't think we've given it much thought, is, of course, their ability to really disrupt us from a political interference perspective. Remember, the Hogue report tells us that we are not doing a very good job in terms of being able to monitor and respond to foreign interference. But the Hogue report only focuses on the 5 states that we've always sort of traditionally have recognized as doing that: Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan, and India. I think that the realization and the reports coming out of Greenland, where there are indications that the Americans are trying to do it within Greenland, I think it would be naive on the Canadian part to think that the Americans are not going to be trying to do that against us now. I mean, you think in terms of taking advantage of existing divides. I mean, obviously, here in my home province of Alberta, there would be an obvious opportunity for them to try to further facilitate the separatist movement within Alberta, to further divide us and weaken us in that context. And so I think that we have to be cognitive to the fact that they clearly had the ability to do that. And, will they start doing it? Will they try to accelerate the divides that we have within our society? And are we equipped to actually start detecting that, since we've got such close cooperation? I mean, we've been working with the Americans against the Russian and Chinese and Iranian interference, and now all of a sudden we've got to figure out, well, now we've got to keep an eye on those people. And so it's sort of a layered approach that I think that the Americans will be bringing against us. And there's the fourth element. There is, of course, the instability of Trump's personality and the way he responds to what he perceives as slights. We know that from, the bizarre behavior he has about the Nobel Peace Prize. But, I mean, remember, Carney got that standing ovation at Davos. And, of course, everyone's pointing out that it's only been Mandela and Zelensky that's ever done that. I mean, those type of things push Trump to act in ways that no other normal president has acted. And so that introduces a wild card factor to all of this. And I think these are the factors that we have to be paying attention to the most.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier the Prime Minister Carney's speech in Davos this week, where he publicly reiterated Canada's support for Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark, but also advocated for value-based realism as a new approach to this new world order, quoting Finnish President Alexander Stubb. What message does this speech send to allies and to Washington in terms of Arctic posture, about Canada's red lines, and maybe even can we think of a change in Canada's thinking on defense investments?
Well, I mean, it was a very powerful speech. And as we noted earlier, it was one of 3 that have ever received a standing ovation. So the speech itself introduced a whole host of ideas. As a political scientist, you got to love a speech that, of course, makes reference to Thucydides and the Peloponnesian Wars, when he talks about some of the elements of it. Of course, being a political scientist, I know that particular reference that he's making is where the weak state actually gets completely wiped out by the strong state. That's the Millennium debates, where Athens said to the city-state of Milan, you better give up your values, you get into value realism, give up your values, double-cross Sparta, or else we will wipe you out. And of course, what the Millennials end up doing is they say, no, because we have these values, we have to stick to the values, and the Athenians are good to their word, and destroy the city, kill all the men, and sell all the women and children into slavery. So, I mean, without, I think, necessarily intending it, he sends sort of a double message there. So, like, we need value realism, but by the way, if you have any values, you risk being completely destroyed by the great power. That being what it was. The reality is, I think many countries will look at Canada and say, you know what, you do recently the last 15 years or so, you've become very efficient at rhetoric, but you never follow up. I mean, remember the applause, that the Trudeau administration got in its early years. We would have the Prime Minister making these great speech, Canada's back. And we would see it being celebrated in Vanity Fair and all sorts of publications that were saying, yeah, these are the type of thoughts, these are the type of thinkings that we need. But the problem is, as we saw with strong, secure, and engaged, again, a coherent, good policy, but one that was never implemented. I mean, remember, the Liberals said it was fully costed. I never ever understood what that meant. But we know that nothing really flowed from it. We never got any replacement for the fighters, no submarines, no real meaningful development for the land forces. So I think that a lot of people might be saying, yes, that's an interesting idea. He enunciated it very well, offered opposition against Trump without naming Trump. So, I mean, I think people were appreciative of that. My suspicion is, though, that a lot of the other countries are looking at Canada and saying, okay, Carney, are you different from the former administration? You've got excellent wordsmithing, but are you actually going to do something about it? What does it actually look like to have a value-based realism? Is that, again, the type of rhetoric where Trudeau's saying Canada's back and the world needs more Canada, and then it kind of disappears, to be quite frank. We don't even end up with a foreign policy throughout that entire period. Or will there be a difference? And I mean, right now, I think the evidence is pointing to the fact that Carney seems determined to be different in that way. We see him getting rid of a lot of the policies that Trudeau had that many people say were performative environmental security steps, plastic straws and all that aspects. So, time will, yeah, and unfortunately we have a short supply of it, but we'll be seeing by his actions, does he basically break the log jams that are being created at D&D? Do we see the energy projects that then get into energy security and the needs of our allies? Will he be able to move ahead quickly with that and demonstrate that it's not all talk? And I think that becomes the critical point.
Rob, that was fantastic, very helpful. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, it's always my pleasure. I mean, the CDA does such great work.
We'll now turn to our interview with Marisol Maddox. Marisol, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Pauline.
So I'd like to start by looking at this from the U.S. side. Much of the public justification for renewed U.S. interest in Greenland framed by the administration around national security, resources, and keeping China and Russia out. So how do you think we should distinguish between the rhetoric being used and the actual drivers behind it? To what extent is this really about resources and strategic competition? And what does it signal about how the U.S. understands sovereignty, influence, and security in the Arctic?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. So first and foremost, I would say that when President Trump says it's important to deter Russia and China, we are all on the same page about that. That is absolutely, a thing. Russia and China in recent years have been increasing their cooperation, including with their militaries and including in the Arctic. And that is concerning. China has gained tremendous leverage over Russia, especially after the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine, because of Russia having limited partners of who would work with them. And China has been investing in their Arctic capabilities. There was a recent development where they had a research submarine that went up to the North Pole and reached new depths. So they're really challenging American undersea dominance. And the activity that we're seeing militarily between Russia and China is really off the coast of Alaska, not off the coast of Greenland. But when we're thinking about the prospects of Russian aggression expanding, particularly after the war in Ukraine, there is expected to be a reconstitution of Russia's military. And so it's incredibly important to be deterring them. And so for that deterrence to be effective, really what needs to happen right now is Ukraine needs to be given what they need to win, because the lesson that Russia needs to take from their full-scale invasion of Ukraine is that the costs of invading a peaceful sovereign country are not worth it, right? And so that is an essential component then of how we think about, from a U.S. perspective, how to approach the Greenland issue. And this is where we're kind of seeing a bit of a disconnect between the purported interests, right? So saying we're seeing Russian and Chinese military activity off of Greenland. That's been very clear that that's really not the case. What we have seen from China previously was really this predatory economic activity that had a lot of potential. And that was kind of really peaked around 2018. And through allied cooperation, we were able to really nip those aspirations in the bud. There's a great report that came out from Harvard's Arctic Initiative that shows the status of Chinese investment and presence in the Arctic. And you see that largely their interests in most of the Arctic have fallen flat because of understanding the ways that could be leveraged for political influence or dual use infrastructure. And so this is really just about looking at how much we have to gain from cooperation. When you look at the actual acute threats we see in Greenland, something like the climate change impacts to Patuxent Space Base are actually more acute, ironically, since the Trump administration is taking a formal climate denial approach.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful to hear this. And in your response, you talk about deterrence and the protection of Greenland. At Davos yesterday, President Trump suggested that Greenland and Denmark lack the capacity to defend themselves, to defend the territory. And that claim has been used over the past weeks to justify a potential stronger U.S. involvement. From a factual standpoint, how accurate is that portrayal?
So the figures that President Trump cited in his speech were from 2019, and that was 7 years ago. So there's been a lot of changes. Denmark has invested $13.7 billion of defense commitments to Greenland. So they're, bringing on F-35s. We have new radar. We have new, patrol vessels, long-range drones. So they're really stepping up in terms of, the investments that are needed to be able to contribute to all domain awareness and to, detect, track, defend against any threats that we see. But it's also really important to note that Greenland is a member of NATO. And so any attack against Greenland would, trigger a NATO response. And so it's about that collective whole, right? And that we're so much stronger when we're working together as opposed to being fragmented.
And I'd like to hear, because you mentioned the strain on the alliance. What do these current events reveal about the limits of alliance coordination in the Arctic when the challenge comes from within the alliance? And where do you see the biggest risk for NATO if these kind of tensions become normalized beyond the Greenland episode?
Yeah, so trust is just at the core of this alliance, right? And so that's really just, it's so foundational, and it's something that if it's not there, it just makes so many other aspects of cooperation that much more challenging, right? So, we have this major NATO exercise coming up in March, right, with cold response that the Norwegians are hosting. And the U.S. In all of the Arctic strategies for the different armed services, from the major Department of Defense strategy, they talk about the critical importance of allies to be able to learn from them, to be more interoperable. The U.S. is still relearning and trying to really mainstream the knowledge of how to operate in the Arctic, not just to survive, but to thrive and to be able to fight, right? And fight and to win. And there's still we're still not there yet. We still need to be learning things. We still need to be updating the basic kit that we're using. So, it's a kind of a weird situation because the US is saying, we want you to teach us how to be basically more lethal in the Arctic, but at the same time saying, and if we're interested in your territory, we may use these skills to invade you, which is just not conducive to getting the best information. And this obviously goes well beyond Greenland, because as you noted, the latest image that President Trump showed, this artificial intelligence image that showed the US flag covering Canada as well. I mean, Canada is a NATO ally. And so I think things have fundamentally changed. I think Prime Minister Carney's speech at Davos really highlighted that. And, I think this really is a moment where, even if we're able to, find some type of, agreement with, Greenland and Denmark to be able to, that's not a violation of their sovereignty and that everybody can agree to, which I'm very much hoping we can do. Even still, there's so many questions about, okay, how is the U.S. going to be approaching Canada? Just the language in the national security strategy about the Western Hemisphere being so aggressive, and the limits or the lack of limits, really, that the administration perceives in their pursuit of hemispheric dominance. We're just at this really profound inflection point. And so I hope that we'll, be able to convey really, to U.S. Congress and, to the American people why NATO matters and just how important it is to not learn the hard way, and to limit any further damage.
And what you just said just brings me to my last question. I was wondering how you think Canada should interpret the rhetoric about Greenland. From what you said, it feels like you see it more as a signal of a broader shift in how the U.S. views Arctic sovereignty, allied territory, more than a one-off provocation. But yes, from a Canadian perspective, what do you think should be read between the lines?
Yeah, I think Canada needs to take this extremely seriously. Take President Trump at his word. If he's showing, the U.S. flag over Canada, referring to Canada as the 51st state, saying he does not recognize our borders, things like this, it needs to be listened to. And I think, Canada has announced a lot of investments into the Arctic. And so I think we really just need to see that follow through. We've already, of course, been seeing Canada strengthening the relationship with Europe and with the EU. I think that's really fantastic. So, I think it's just really, that it's hard because the U.S. and Canada we're neighbors, incredibly close allies. We have the only binational military commands in the world with NORAD. So it's so important that we're able to, continue that cooperation. And so I think, there's a very strong case that with Trump pursuing Golden Dome, there is absolutely no need for the U.S. to acquire any territory in order to enact Golden Dome. You can integrate different components into it and add sensors and, do all these things. There's absolutely no reason why the U.S. needs to acquire any more territory. And so, there's many ways that we can maneuver to figure out a path forward together. But I think Canada's been, taking the right tact, which is, being firm about Canadian sovereignty and, principled, and, that this is, we have a bar that we're not going to lower, right? And I think that's really just what needs to happen.
Yeah, and to finish, I'd like to end by hearing your thoughts. Within Washington, where do you see the biggest disconnects or flaws in how this issue is being approached currently? Talking about Greenland, but also more broadly speaking, we just spoke about Canada, so Arctic sovereignty in general. And if allies like Canada want to bring more evidence and restraint into the debate, who actually matters most to engage inside the US decision-making system?
Yeah, so from a climate perspective, it is just such an incredible strategic misstep for the United States to be formally climate deniers, right? Not just saying that this isn't our priority, but to do things like to dismantle the Strategic Futures Group at the National Intelligence Council, which creates the Global Trends Report, which looks at future scenarios, including how climate change intersects with other dimensions. This to not include these changes at a time where we're seeing it's really beyond climate change, right? We're seeing this profound undermining of the planetary boundaries that make the Earth conducive to human habitation. And so to disregard that creates opportunities for America's adversaries, and it creates blind spots for us. And so I think our allies taking environmental change seriously is incredibly important to minimize their blind spots, but also because at some point, hopefully, the U.S. will realize that this politicization of just the reality of the life on our planet is not conducive to future American prosperity. And we're going to be in catch-up mode, and we're going to need to hopefully you guys will have made more progress and we can, come back at some point. But, having Finland, create a report on the future, which integrates climate into future scenarios, having Canada leading CASCO, the Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence for NATO, that's such an important entity for really, having a vision and a boldness and really the confidence to be able to move this work forward, because we really cannot afford to be backtracking. Yeah, I think, just from a pragmatic perspective, it's just about understanding how are things changing? What does it mean for, many different things? And then how do you adapt to get in front of it? And that's how you have future prosperity. So, just speaking about it from a practical level, it's not about any type of partisan ideology. It's just about allowing your eyes to see, the reality. And, in terms of who to be engaging around policy, I think the embassy is just getting out there and speaking to different stakeholders. That this is just a really complicated time for America. And, this is, I don't know, we're just navigating a really challenging moment. And, we'll see. There's certain things we can control and certain things we can't, but just important to keep that dialogue going and work with, partners who have, the same values and priorities.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. Thank you for joining us and sharing your insights from a U.S. perspective.
Thanks so much for having me, Pauline.
Thank you very much to Heather, Rob, and Marisol for sharing their insights on this fast-moving situation and for helping us understand the stakes for Greenland sovereignty, Arctic security, allied unity, and for Canada. That is all for today's episode. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, the Climate Security Program, or our broader work on Arctic and international security, Follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our YouTube channel or to our newsletter for the latest updates. If you have comments or feedback on today's discussion, please email me at pauline@cdainstitute.ca. I'm Pauline Baudu. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back soon with more expert analysis on the issues shaping Canada's defense and security environment.